When you need to send the perfect rose bouquet, only one brand can say they've been the floral authority for 50 years. 1-800-Flowers. Why should you trust 1-800-Flowers? They hand-select every stem to ensure top quality. And with nationwide delivery, smiles and satisfaction are 100% guaranteed. And right now, when you order a dozen multicolored roses, we'll double it at no extra cost. Don't miss out on this limited time offer. Order today at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
2ndCast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
As they were prepping for trial, defense attorney Rich Fink asked the psychiatrist if Geschwendt could be cured. They both laughed. "Well, what's funny about that?" Fink asked. "He would need decades of close, personal, intense psychotherapy, and I wouldn't want to be one of his therapists," one said. Then they both laughed again. "What's funny about that?" Fink asked again. "He will want to kill whoever gets close to him," one of them said. From Killer in the House by Kathryn Canavan. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. We are deep in a true crime book that I'm featuring, Killer in the House, 10 Days of Terror in a Pennsylvania Suburb by Kathryn Canavan, who worked for a local suburban newspaper reporting as this story unfolded. This is Part 3, Episode 177, Solved and Unsolved, on one of the most sensational crimes of the 20th century. And you should listen to Part 1 and 2 before you get to Part 3. Just a little piece of advice. In Part 2, the detectives are working the crime scene for the Abts murders of Mom and Dad, Jack and Peggy, and their children, Margie, Johnny, Kathy, and Margie's boyfriend, Gary Engle, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we learned on that same date, March 12, 1976, an elderly couple, Ed and Marguerite Volgenberger, were shot to death after being tortured with a stun gun. These 8 murders, causing fear and anxiety across Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and beyond. Due to a few lucky breaks, a suspect emerged, however, George Geschwendt, a neighbor of the Abts that lived right across the street, and he confessed to the murders, being arrested on day 10. Now, a quick reminder, my next Patreon Zoom, where we discuss true crime trials, documentaries, and the next book to be featured on my podcast, it is tomorrow, August 6th, 2026, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can support the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast by joining for $2 to $4 a month, which is $24 a year? So I hope to see you there tomorrow. I have some great books to suggest. So let us begin. The news broke that a suspect had been arrested, prompting editors to quickly send reporters to cover the story. Kathryn was assigned to interview Michael and Clifford Abt. However, what none of them realized was that Chief Michaels had announced the arrest without notifying either of the surviving family members. All right, this lack of courtesy was striking and a very poor decision. After all, the Geschwendts lived directly across the street from Michael and Clifford. A little past midnight, Kathryn arrived to find cars parked outside and the Abt kitchen lights on. As she stepped inside, she was about to ask what they knew about the arrest when reality shifted. What in the world? The radio was playing, and Michael and his friends were gathered around the table, talking and laughing, unfazed by the arrest? Really? And guns were spread out, some laying on the table, one on the sofa, and a loaded shotgun was propped up nearby. A horrible thought hit Kathryn. Maybe they don't know. Just then, Clifford walked through the front door, the now preferred entrance to their home. Now Kathryn was worried that they might hear the news on the radio. And Kathryn did not know what we know, that the Geschwendts lived across the street. The Abt landline in the kitchen rang at 1 a.m., and it was for Kathryn. Her colleague gave her the suspect's name, George Geschwendt. Writing the name down on her pad, she repeated each letter as the name was spelled out, just as Michael's buddy, Edward Myers, slid past her, slowly because he was on crutches, and he glanced at her writing and shouted, quote, "It's Geschwendt," with Kathryn freezing in place. "What about him?" Michael yelled. "Geschwendt killed your family." The next sound that came was a heartbreaking, mournful gasp. Without a word, the two sons bolted for the door at the same time. Their friends gathered behind them as they headed for the small Cape Cod house across the street. End quote. Well, what she was seeing didn't make sense to Kathryn, because again, she didn't know Geschwendt was right across the street. Like something out of a comedy, she saw Michael and Clifford get stuck in the door, trying to pass through it at the same time. With more reporters arriving, it looked like the sons were in a fistfight, struggling to get out. And this was a surreal twist of fate. The Abt family survivors were on their way to kill the Geschwendt family. Well, Kathryn knew they would be right back. They had forgotten the guns. She locked eyes with a friend of Michael's as they both glanced at the weapons, knowing they needed to hide them. Collecting the guns, Kathryn dropped them into the basement, which no longer had stairs leading downward since they had been removed as evidence. They hurried back into the living room just as Clifford burst in, quote, "Where are the guns? Where are the frickin' guns?" And Michael was screaming, "I'll kill the whole family," end quote. Fortunately, Officer Dave Cleese arrived on the scene, and back in the day, he had been a gifted football player, and he tackled Michael before he got to the Geschwendts' very dark house. No lights were on. Chief Michaels had now arrived, and Kathryn avoided him. Going upstairs, she opened the window to listen to the conversations taking place, and it was pandemonium. Friends, reporters, and now uniformed police were milling on the front lawn, cursing punctuated by soft voices downstairs as the officers talked down Clifford and Michael from an emotional cliff. Geschwendt is locked up, and his family is not home. Calm down. Then, relieved, Kathryn saw the guns being removed from the house. Learning that Geschwendt lived next door, she wondered how things could have snowballed to the point where 6 innocent people were dead. And returning to the newsroom, she made a warm tea to take the chill off as she wrote her story. At his home, George's older brother, Fred Geschwendt, answered the door and found 5 detectives with a search warrant. His mother, Josephine Geschwendt Cologne, broke down in tears and rushed to her bedroom, later needing to be admitted to the hospital. Led by Detective Edwards, the team collected clothing and black vinyl saddlebags. Fred and his sisters declined to talk to the police. At the hospital, Detective Bob Eckert and Tom Darika-Catoli interviewed Mrs. Cologne, with a nurse present. Completely overwhelmed, she was distressed about her son. He had earned a college degree, and then she had nothing more to say. Using George's high school graduation photo, headlines announced that the murderer was found right across the street. A teenage girl said that she recognized George Geschwendt. When she was collecting for the Abts, George Geschwendt had donated. Neighbors were shocked senseless, as no one expected a local to be involved. Now, I did suspect it was someone from the community. If you remember, back when the police were canvassing the neighbors after the bodies were found, Felix Iastraco had mentioned that his dog always barks at strangers, and he had not barked that day. This tells me that the dog was somewhat familiar with the killer, who turned out to be local. One firefighter, Bob Hickey, who helped drain the Abts pool, expressed disbelief. Quote, "All of this because they called you names? I got picked on for years, all through school. Anyone named Hickey faced ridicule. That he killed 6 people over that really shook me." Unquote. Now, I remember back in the day chanting, "I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks onto you." What it comes down to is that parents have to hold their kids accountable when they start calling each other names so that other people don't wind up bullied. And it really matters. Michael hadn't spoken to George in 2 months. They really hadn't had contact for 8 or 9 years, and he would never have suspected him. They had once been best friends, hanging out, building forts, until they got in trouble in middle school and George's mother ended their friendship. While transporting George Geschwendt to the county jail in Doylestown, approximately 40 miles away, Lieutenant Zajac and Detective Bensalem made a stop at Washington Crossing State Park. They wanted George to show them the location where he had discarded his boots, which would likely match the bloody footprint found in the Abt basement, and possibly the one at the Volkenberger's home as well. During the car ride, George suddenly blurted out his frustrations, saying that nothing he tried to improve his life had worked. He had joined the Navy, but was a failure. He earned an associate's degree, but couldn't get a job. He attended truck driving school, and that didn't work either. He lacked experience, and he was considered overqualified. He lived at home with his mother. He was a loser. And after all of that and searching around, the boots were not found. Another failure. And now, for his own protection, George was placed in maximum security. Speaking to the media, Chief Michaels announced that this was a grudge killing with no drug connections, clearing Clifford Abt of any suspicion, a huge relief to him. Decades later, Clifford shared with Kathryn on how he'd been treated by the community and press, his sarcasm very real. Quote, "I'd like to thank all these people who came down to the police station with information about me, people I didn't even know. I especially appreciate all the know-it-alls who know more about me than I do myself. Please, ask them to stop around and tell me what my life is all about. Then maybe they can start eating their words with salt and pepper." End quote. Keep in mind that Clifford and Michael Abt were victims in this as well, and victims should be treated with respect. So by spring 1976, the alleged killer was in custody, the insurance claims had been processed, and flowers were blooming. The only motive identified for the massacre was supposed bullying by the Abt brothers, who taunted George, and one even called him Banana Nose. John Gottschalk recalled seeing Clifford hit George on the back of his head and call him a faggot. Since John was bigger, he warned Clifford that he would retaliate if it continued. Quote, "They singled him out. He didn't come from the best family. His father wasn't in the picture, and I was brought up with a religious background, and it hurt me to see what they did." End quote. So there's one confirmation that the bullying had occurred. Now, in the 1970s, the attitude towards verbal bullying was to shake it off and move on. Like I said, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me," was another defensive chant, and having a good comeback was always admired. Another one from the era, "Up your nose with a rubber hose." Richard Fink became George's defense attorney, and he chose not to emphasize the bullying during the trial, as it would not have justified the severity of the killings. Fink stated, quote, "The lesson for today is that the time bombs do surround us, and they must be spotted by teachers, friends, neighborhood, and psychologists so they can be diffused," end quote. So the lesson is clear for all. Stop bullying. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Have some understanding, compassion, and empathy. Well, for the record, Michael denied harassing George, while Clifford claimed he hadn't paid any attention to George since his mother intervened way back in middle school. And then the reality of the situation hit both Clifford and Michael suddenly. The reality was they were both unemployed. On the day of the murders, the county tax bill arrived. Both now expressed their willingness to work for free, and they could take a salary later after learning the job. Someone just needed to give them a chance. And on March 29th, a letter that Peggy had mailed to Clifford while he was in jail was forwarded to him. And that had to be an incredibly bittersweet moment. On March 30th, a U-Haul arrived at the Geschwendts' house with a police escort, and they would never set foot back in this house on Fleetwood Avenue. Bensalem police continued to gather evidence and work with the district attorney in Doylestown. George was arraigned on April 28, 1976, and entered a not guilty plea, his tone and actions robotic. A trial was set for July 12th, 4 months after the massacre, and Fink began planning the defense, having George consult with a psychiatrist, where George stated that his only achievement was the shootings. The Wallenberger case was still an active investigation. On May 27th, Ed Wallenberger's brother Ralph oversaw the auction of his brother and sister-in-law's belongings. Items ranged from mason jars and waffle irons to a washing machine, and all were available to the highest bidder. Almost 1,000 bargain hunters and curiosity onlookers attended the event, and rumors suggested that plainclothes detectives were among the crowd. A homemade Monopoly game sold for $5, while the most sought-after item was the old Ford tractor, which sold for $3,750. Judge Paul R. Beckert, known for his tough demeanor, would preside over the Commonwealth versus Geschwendt case. District Attorney Ken Biehn, age 27, was a Duke Law School graduate and had been recognized by the Jaycees as one of Pennsylvania's 10 outstanding young men. Defense attorney Fink, well, he was 4 years out of Temple Law School, and he opted not to join his father's Levittown law firm, and instead took on the clients that others avoided. Both sides would invest hundreds of hours into the case, which ultimately cost Fink his marriage. Ken Biehn was a college psychology major who had read dozens of books on the insanity defense. He instinctively knew that George's attorneys would be exploring this, likely paranoid schizophrenia. Philadelphia's infamous killer, Joseph Callinger, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Knowing this, Biehn was hoping for a similar outcome. And one of these days, I'm going to have to do a book on the Callinger case, which is kind of complicated. He was convicted of killing 3 people, including one of his sons, and died in prison in 1996. So Fink and his co-counsel, Terry Clemens, were acutely aware that George's life was at stake and that the death penalty was a very real possibility. The confession he'd made posed a significant challenge to his case. George had told Detective Batesel that if he ever got free, quote, he would finish the job, end quote, a direct threat to Michael and Clifford. Well, this was certainly devastating evidence that Fink knew would be presented in court. Quote, Fink had already warned Geschwendt at the outset that his case was nearly impossible to win, because in addition to killing 6 human beings of all ages, he had killed a St. Bernard. There's no way to win a case when you kill a St. Bernard, end quote. But Fink kept his sense of humor even when his clients faced long odds. He admired the police and the polygraph examiners, buying a gag gift for one, a small door plaque with the words, "Confession taken daily from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Okay, that is frigging hilarious. And Fink's reputation for practical jokes was legendary. Fink was trying to get George's mother to cooperate and share some of the troubling experiences from her son's past, but she just stared and remained mute. Frustrated, he shouted that the prosecution wants to, quote, boil his brains until it comes out his ears, end quote, and then threw a pen at her. Well, this snapped her out of her stupor, and she threatened to complain to the district attorney, the guy who was trying to kill her son, about the person who was trying to save her son's life. There's some issues going on there. And Fink just shook his head. At least George's sister Betty was supportive. And please understand this. This is Rich Fink's first murder case. He would invest a lot into doing what was best for his client. Meanwhile, the Volgenbergers' double murder was going cold. By now, all of the items owned by Ed and Marguerite had been sold, and now the property itself was up for auction. A Bensalem farmer snatched up the farmhouse and 14 acres for $88,000, which is about $515,000 today. In a warm and humid July 1976, jury selection began. It was anticipated that the trial would last 2 weeks, and jurors would be sequestered for the duration at the local Holiday Inn, which is now the New Hope Inn and Suites. Upon entering the courtroom, some of the potential jurors clearly expressed their reluctance. One man mentioned that he had to return home each night to give his wife spending money. One woman was concerned that no one would be able to look after her electrical appliances if she was on jury duty, as her refrigerator needed defrosting. Oh boy. Some others claimed that the horrific murder involved children, which made it difficult for them to remain objective. And a Quaker mentioned that he was uncertain about being able to vote for the death penalty. They were all excused. During voir dire, Geschwendt showed no interest at all, doodling on a pad. His family were absent, although Clifford and Michael Abt were observing. Fink noted one potential juror reading a dog magazine and recognized that that could be an issue given the death of Heidi. And the potential juror admitted that she could not be fair to someone who might have harmed a dog, so she was also excused from the jury. All 78 potential jurors were screened, but none were found to be able to serve on this jury. Then Rich Fink, who was a master of research, found an old statute that, quote, authorized the sheriff to pull unsuspecting passerbyers right off the street and press them into jury service on the spot, with the judge granting the unusual request, end quote. Well, it took some time, but eventually 5 men and 7 women were sworn in to decide George Geschwendt's fate. None of them were dog lovers or opposed to the death penalty. They were isolated from other hotel guests, ate separately, and could only listen to the radio or watch TV under supervision. There were no mail or phone privileges, and while they could have alcohol, they had to pay for it themselves and could only drink in the juror dining room. The headlines about the Abt trial were prominent from coast to coast as the trial began on July 12th. Journalists and spectators quickly filled the gallery, many wearing Coke-bottom shoes, while the men sported mutton-chop sideburns. When George Geschwendt entered the courtroom, the spectators leaned forward to catch a better glimpse of him. Behind Fink and the defense table sat friends of Michael and Clifford, who quietly made zzz, zzz, sounds reminiscent of an electric chair, sounds that Fink could hear, but the judge could not. Oh, wow. Attention was focused on the attorneys as they presented their opening statements, with George yawning. Ken Biehn told the fast-paced story of Geschwendt breaking in, lying in wait, and shooting 4 adults and 2 children in the face. He recounted how Peggy Abt was hit with such force that she fell backwards down the basement stairs, with Clifford enduring hearing about his mother's last minute of life, jaw clenching. Biehn described George Geschwendt as cool, calm, and collected. He had meticulously planned these murders and executed them with frightening efficiency, one by one, over the course of 11 hours. When Rich Fink spoke, he shocked everyone, admitting that George Geschwendt had committed the murders. The evidence would demonstrate that his client was not legally responsible, as he suffered from late-stage paranoid schizophrenia. George was born into a dysfunctional family, which exacerbated the condition he had always struggled with. As a result, George Geschwendt should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Fink then went on to describe George's traumatic childhood, which included a brutal alcoholic father who showed no regard for his children or wife. The family seldom spoke and never expressed affection for one another. The fence in their backyard consisted of black railroad ties topped with barbed wire, a sight George likened to a concentration camp. The only exception in George's bleak life was the Abt family, whom he became obsessed with, believing that he was, quote, elected to kill them all, end quote. He was totally out of touch with reality. There was no rational motive behind his actions, which were the tragic consequence of severe mental illness. Now, during this, Judge Beckert interrupted Fink a number of times, instructing him to clearly outline what he intended to prove. But nervous, Fink just continued saying what he had planned. He hoped to evoke some sympathy for George, but by now, they were barely into the trial and the judge was already fed up with Mr. Fink. Ken Biehn presented witnesses to lay out the evidence quickly, without any delays or time for the jurors' thoughts to meander. The presentation was well organized and extremely fast-paced. His closing argument would tie everything together. Witnesses testified that George purchased the 22 Sturm Ruger with the deadly Magnum bullets on March 5th, and then immediately reported the gun stolen. Michael Abts' testimony connected with the jury as he recounted coming home to a dark kitchen, turning on the lights, and seeing a blood smear which had confused him. He then found Johnny's sweatshirt, which was soaked with blood. Next, the medical evidence was presented, which elicited gasps in the courtroom, while Clifford nervously chewed his nails. The jurors grimaced as they viewed haunting photos of the 6 victims, contrasting sharply with the colorful family photo of the smiling Abt family, which I have posted on my blog. Noted for his calm and competent demeanor on the stand, County Detective Dick Bensalem testified next, and he recounted George's confession almost verbatim from his notes, leaving the jury taken aback by the callousness of it. The prosecutor asked, quote, "Did George express any regrets?" The detective replied, "Yes. He was sorry he couldn't get the other 2. End quote. Biehn knew he needed to prove that Geschwendt was aware of right and wrong when he committed the murders. He then asked Bensalem, quote, "So that's all he said?" End quote. And this gave Fink pause. He felt an uneasy sensation as he reread the confession. George hadn't mentioned anything else. What was Biehn referring to? Quote, "A nagging feeling from somewhere rose up in me quite rapidly," Fink recalled. "Objection!" At sidebar, Fink asked why Biehn had asked that when there was nothing else in the confession. And Judge Becker turned to Biehn. Did he say anything else? And the answer was a hesitant yes. What? The judge said. Judge, Geschwendt told Bensalem that he knew it was wrong when he did it, end quote. Fink frowned. Wait, this information had not been provided to him as required during discovery. If it had been, it would have torpedoed the insanity defense. Thus, the judge ruled, and the jury never heard this. Yeah, police have told me that if it is not written down in the report, it never happened. The district attorney now presented two psychiatrists who believed that Geschwendt was fully aware of right and wrong when he killed 6 people. Fink managed to get them to agree that George was ill and paranoid. Biehn then called a neighbor to the stand, Brad Batchelor, who testified that George had told him how he managed to fake his way out of the Navy. He had hated his time there, but he didn't tell the Navy psychiatrist that. Instead, he acted quiet when the doctors asked him questions, and it worked. As eyes turned to George Geschwendt, who sat at the defense table, avoiding eye contact and remaining quiet, exactly as Brad had described. Fink wanted to call George's mother and siblings to testify about their brutal and bizarre upbringing, but only one of them agreed to do so. As a result, he had to rely on psychiatric testimony for the defense. 2 experts on paranoid schizophrenia were initially reluctant to testify. They warned Fink that he was unlikely to win this case, but after much persuasion, they eventually agreed to help. During the case preparation, Fink asked them whether George could be cured, and this is the statement that I opened this episode with the psychiatrist saying no, that he would need tremendous amounts of psychotherapy, and that George would want to kill anyone who got close to him, psychiatrists included. George blamed all his troubles on the Abts because they were the only people that had ever bothered to have a social relationship with him. Sworn in, Dr. Richard Lonsdorf, a nationally recognized expert on the insanity defense, testified that George was paranoid and constantly afraid of rejection. It shocked the jury and spectators to learn that George had never been touched, never kissed, never petted by another human being. He focused on his perceived imperfections. His nose was too big. His voice sounded funny. He had lost parts of his fingers. He was obsessed with the Abts, blaming them and viewing them as everything he was not. Fun-loving, high energy, and always socializing with friends. Sometimes George fantasized about being friends with them again, and other times he imagined that they were under his control, like his thralls, characteristics of a true love-hate relationship. Now, psychology tells us that before psychosis becomes full-blown, protomal warning signs occur. These are early, subtle changes in a person's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. This period can last from weeks to years, and if noticed, intervention can dramatically improve the long-term outcomes. But no one was there to notice in George's case. The lone exception was when Michael Abt and his friends wished George a Merry Christmas 3 months before the murders. And they said he was zombie-like, lacking facial expression, speaking in a robotic monotone voice, appearing emotionally numb, which are all the symptoms of this psychosis. But no one living with George noticed in the environment where talking and communication was muted. Research also tells us that when paranoid and obsessive thoughts converge, thinking becomes fixated, as in this case on the Abts. George is a very asocial person and suffers from persecutory delusions, a fixed false belief that the neighbors are actively harming, stalking, or plotting against him, because George lacks any social outlets to reality test these fears, the delusions grow. I also see delusional misidentification occurring. While the perpetrator's brain may misinterpret a neighbor's benign daily activities, like walking to their car with friends or playing music, as aggressive signals or codes directed specifically at them. So, for example, George believed that the Abts made him a target of practical jokes and laughed at him. If the phone rang and a caller hung up, he assumed this was the Abts mocking him, although in reality this was highly unlikely. But the hang-up confirmed his delusion. When Heidi innocently pooped on his lawn, he thought it was because the Abts had taught her to do this to humiliate him. And this paranoia fosters irrational suspicions, even more so, again aimed at the Abts, who are a threat and actively trying to ruin his life. As anxiety increased, hypervigilance intensifies, leading individuals to search for hidden motives behind others' actions, which we see happening. These repetitive paranoid thoughts cycle over and over in one's mind, resulting in increasing social isolation and difficulty functioning in daily life. Cognition becomes rigid, making it impossible to accept any alternative viewpoints or recognize that one's problems may stem from one's own perceptions and oneself. It is truly unfortunate because there are medications and therapies available to help with this disorder, but George was unable to take advantage of them due to a combination of factors: his mindset, his lack of familiar support, and his unemployment. Since his family members didn't communicate with each other, they were unaware of the mental turmoil he was experiencing. But was he legally insane when he killed the Abts and Gary Engle? Testimony revealed that by Thanksgiving 1975, George believed that either he or the Abts had to go. This rigid all-or-nothing worldview also contributed to his suspicions. And then the entire courtroom gasped again when Dr. Ulysses Watson, director of the Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, testified that George had confessed to his mother the day after the killings and boasted about the killings as his only accomplishment. Calling Josephine Cologne to the stand, George's mother was a pale, gray-haired woman who broke down in uncontrollable sobs. A 30-minute recess was called. When she returned to the stand, she said nothing, her behavior mirroring that of her son, and the judge excused her. Betty Geschwendt Kennedy, George's sister, then took the stand to testify. She described her brother as the shyest, most withdrawn of her siblings. With her eyes fixed to the floor, she recounted their horrible, unhappy childhood marked by an alcoholic father who threw dishes at them, and they were constantly fearful. He treated them like possessions, chased them with knives, barbed wire was strung around their backyard, and he had even attempted to run over them with his car. Quote, "Did George ever laugh?" she was asked, and struggled to recall a moment of joy. "Did George have any friends?" And she replied simply, "Only the Abts," end quote. Rich Fink concluded by stating that George was mentally ill to the extent that he could not differentiate between right and wrong. His thinking was clearly disordered. He was mentally ill. Just minutes after murdering the only people who had ever befriended him, he returned home and made a tuna fish sandwich. He truly had no understanding of the gravity of his actions. And then it was up to the jury. The judge provided them with instructions, which would become an issue as he did not adequately explain that if they returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, George Geschwendt would be committed to a secure psychiatric facility. 35 minutes later, the jury rendered a guilty verdict for 6 counts of first-degree murder. Clifford and Michael had gone to grab lunch and thus weren't back in time to hear the verdict read by the foreman, Walter Boritsky. George, however, never looked up, doodling. The remaining question was sentencing, life in prison or the death penalty. Fink pleaded for mercy, asking them to spare, quote, this struggling piece of humanity and to be the sympathetic ear that George had never known, end quote. The prosecutor calmly pointed out that Geschwendt had meticulously planned the murders and did everything he could to avoid being caught. He knew what he was doing was wrong. Once again, the judge explained that the jury must return a sentence of life imprisonment if they found any mitigating circumstances. Clifford silently shook his head in disagreement. Now, as the jury returned, a line of deputies positioned themselves between the defense table and the Abts and their friends. In the tense silence, the clerk asked, quote, how do you find, death or life in prison? Walter Boritsky spoke up, death, prompting a collective gasp from the spectators, end quote. Eyes found George Geschwendt, who was chewing gum and drawing a car on a notepad. None of George's family members were present to support him, and the only person visibly upset was Sandra Fink, Rich's wife, who was crying. Fink assured George that he would appeal the verdict, and he knew that George was scared when he asked, quote, are they going to kill me in the meantime? End quote. As deputies escorted George to prison, Michael's friend, Edward Myers, cheered, quote, Geschwendt dies, end quote. And the friends celebrated as if the Eagles had just won the Super Bowl. 5 deputies surrounded George as the taunts flew. Quote, hey, George, you got the hot squad, and Geschwendt will burn in hell. And Judge Beckert looked out at the outlandish scene as he realized young men were making fun of the man who admitted to killing 6 people because young men had made fun of him, end quote. While reporters rushed to interview Clifford, he refused them as he and Michael joined in the jeering. I personally find it is really disrespectful to turn the court into a carnival, but I do understand the strong emotions that Clifford and Michael were feeling during this. As the jury was boarded on the bus to collect their belongings at the Holiday Inn, some members spoke to the press. They had not made rash, impulsive decisions, nor were there any hysterical speeches in the jury room. They took only 2 votes, 1 on the first-degree murder charge and 2 on the death penalty. Richard Fink recognized that George urgently needed psychiatric care, and he filed an appeal based on the judge's instructions regarding the insanity defense. And the appeals lingered in the courts for the next 16 years, but ultimately were unsuccessful. Eventually, quote, the Abts sons said they were satisfied that Geschwendt would die for killing their family. But as Michael put it, how can anyone be happy? He viewed the death sentence as a debt being paid, not a victory, end quote. Now, as the decades passed, Michael's view on capital punishment shifted. Quote, back then, I was excited. I was happy. I was mad. I was everything. I was angry as shit. As time went by, I felt the longer George lived, the more he would suffer. I knew I was in for a lifetime of suffering, so why should he get off easy? Now I think only God is the one who has the right to take a life, end quote. George joined 4 others living on death row in Pennsylvania. Stanton Story, who had killed a police officer. Clifford Futch had killed another inmate. Benjamin Davis murdered an elderly newsstand operator while he was robbing the stand. Gerald McKenna had raped and mutilated and killed a 16-year-old girl. Gary Heidnik, a serial killer, was the last person executed by lethal injection in Pennsylvania in July 1999. In 2015, then-Governor Tom Wolf instituted a moratorium because he determined that Pennsylvania's capital punishment system was, quote, ineffective, unjust, and expensive, end quote. There are currently 94 inmates on death row in Pennsylvania. After the sentencing was announced, Chief Michaels held a press conference to commend his detectives. He said he felt relieved, but not elated. District Attorney Ken Biehn attributed the win to excellent police work, emphasizing that without the gun and the confession, they would not have won the case. Kathryn Canavan sat down to type her story for the newspaper with the headline, Geschwendt Receives Death Penalty. Other headlines included, Crowd Taunts Doomed Man, and Sadistic Butcher Gets Hot Seat. In Trevose, residents learned that Geschwendt had been sentenced to death for his horrible actions. Many felt he had effectively sentenced Clifford and Michael to life without their parents, siblings, and good friend Gary Engle. This deadly act sent ripples of pain and loss far beyond just Clifford and Michael. Extended family members, best friends, colleagues, and others who had been part of their lives, including Boy Scouts and godchildren, all experienced profound grief and anger over the senselessness of it all. And Rich Fink would later remark that some people are too flawed to cope with life. Michael and Clifford, along with their fiancés, hosted an after-party to celebrate the end of the trial. After 5 months of grief, investigation, warrants, and court dates, the mood was now buoyant, bringing the Abts case full cycle, from a warm and noisy home to a horrific crime scene, and now back to friendship and life. The verdict hadn't set everything right, and the future was forever shaped by the events of March 12, 1976. However, they could look forward to a future of their own making. A barbecue grill and picnic tables were set up, with Kathryn Canavan chatting with a long, dark-haired man in his 30s when Clifford approached, asking for her help with something. He led her across the yard and leaned in to whisper that she should change seats because the man she was speaking with was crazy. Surprised, she responded that they were only talking, and he seemed nice. But Clifford lowered his voice again and said that the man had recently tried to kill himself. Oh, Kathryn nodded, acknowledging that depression could lead people to suicide attempts, which unfortunately happened. And Clifford leaned in even further, quote, with a machete? End quote. Kathryn did not return to that picnic table. George Geschwendt was sent to Greater Fort, Pennsylvania's largest maximum security prison. This facility was later replaced by the State Correctional Institution Phoenix in Collegeville, which opened in 2018. Pennsylvania's electric chair, nicknamed Old Smoky, was made of oak and disassembled. It was stored in the basement at the State Correctional Institute at Rockview. However, the wires that would deliver the 2,000 volts of electricity were still in place. Used 350 times from 1915 to 1962, Old Smoky's first execution was John Tallop, who killed his wife. The last person electrocuted was Elmo Smith, who had raped and murdered 16-year-old Marion Mitchell in 1959. After being convicted, Smith was sentenced to death and had a last meal of potatoes, lima beans, peach shortcake, and coffee, and the execution of Elmo Smith marked the end of the electric chair's use in Pennsylvania. Opinions about the death penalty began to shift following the sentencing of George Geschwendt. As questions regarding its constitutionality emerged, Bucks County prosecutors brought George back to the courthouse. There, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, in addition to the 6 warrants for his execution, a move intended to ensure that all bases were covered. And George's prison life was not hunky-dory. He got into a fist fight with a prison guard, resulting in a head wound that required 13 stitches. Following this incident, he spent 8 months in solitary confinement, missing his classmate, Patrolman Bill Fox, who had come to Graterford on a police-related matter. No one visited George, except for a new public defender, Seth Weber, who came by in 1979. George said that the other inmates were reading his mind, his paranoid schizophrenia still manifesting. When he was told that his lawyers could vacate his death sentence, George displayed no emotion and simply checked the clock. Puzzled, Seth asked George if he had somewhere to be. Well, in fact, he did. He had a weather class that he enjoyed, and he didn't want to miss it. And this led Seth Weber to conclude that George was not in his right mind. So I think you can see why this case would later inspire 2 episodes of the TV show Criminal Minds in 2011 and 2015. And what about the Volgenberger case? Well, as a tribute to their lost colleague, the Historic Langhorne Association released a travelogue in January 1977, narrated by the late Ed Volgenberger. And while this was a hit, the investigation remained cold and the case remains unsolved. The police were actually able to find some cash hidden in the farm after consulting a psychic. The deal was that if she provided useful information, they would all go out for a steak dinner. The detective who knew the most about the case was instructed to show her photographs of the victims, and she would communicate directly with him. They were careful not to patronize her, as she would view that as an insult. While studying the photos of Ed and Marguerite, she noted that they were wealthy but frugal. They maintained careful financial records and invested in stocks. She suggested that if they thoroughly searched the property piece by piece, they would likely find thousands of dollars hidden away. And she indicated that all of the outbuildings contained items concealed within them and advised checking behind electrical outlets. All right, while heading to the barn, the police began to follow her instructions, checking electrical outlets. Now, previously they had searched, but they found nothing. But this time, a detective reached behind an electrical outlet and discovered 2 small tins containing $3,810. The psychic got her steak dinner. Over the decades, lead detective Mather followed clues in the Volgenberger case across the country, spanning Texas, California, and North Carolina. Now, the piece of evidence I mentioned was a footprint found in the dusty, ransacked attic. It was from a Sears and Roebuck work boot, and Detective Mather would learn that Tomlinson's partner, Dickel, bought all of his clothes and shoes from Sears. Remember that Tomlinson and Dickel were the 2 that had escaped from prison and were on the lam and had been seen in the area right before the murders of the Volgenbergers. 2 guns were used to kill the Volgenbergers. Ed was shot with a .38 caliber, and Marguerite was shot with a .32. The presence of 2 different guns suggests that there were 2 killers. And these 2, Tomlinson and Dickel, were the main suspects. But there has never been enough evidence to make the case stick. Cold case detective David Hanks retired in 2024, and he believes that over time, circumstances can evolve that can help cold cases. Relationships change, criminals and their threats die, and people are more willing to come forward with information. and it is my opinion that Tomlinson and Dickel are responsible for the Volgenbergers' death. They were on the run. Tomlinson was familiar with the farm, and he didn't particularly like Ed and Marguerite, but he knew they had money, which is exactly what two fugitives would need. Tomlinson was a relative who'd been on the farm, he had a violent past, and he would have understood that Ed and Marguerite were unlikely to hand over cash willingly. Hence, they brought the taser with them to torture them. 50 years later, the mystery remains unsolved. And Middletown detective Donald Mather, he went on to become the deputy chief detective for Bucks County, and he died in 2018 at 77 years of age. Anyone with information on the double homicide of Ed and Marguerite Volgenberger can call the Bucks County detectives at 215-348-6354. And that number is on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, July 2026. The Abts house, it has been renovated since 1976, and it was sold for $415,000 in 2021. As it changed hands over the years, the neighbors often took real estate tours to see what had become of the basement. It has been remodeled into a family room with a laundry area and could serve as an in-law suite. Under Pennsylvania law, while sellers must disclose plumbing problems or other issues, there is no legal requirement to inform prospective buyers about a house's history of violent incidences or deaths. The Abts trial was barely over when national attention turned to another spree killing. On July 29, 1976, two women sitting in a double-parked Oldsmobile in Pelham Bay, Bronx, New York City, when a man approached their car and fired 3 bullets. One woman was injured, while the other died instantly. And this marked the beginning of the Son of Sam's reign of terror. Over a year later, David Berkowitz would be arrested. July 13, 1977, the Great Blackout hit New York City, the first since the Great Northeast Blackout of 1965, which had affected 10 states and parts of Canada. Now, I remember the one from 1977. I do not remember the Great Northeast Blackout of 65. Now, Kathryn Canavan went to New York City with a colleague, a photographer who wanted to capture some historic photos. And they saw that looters had broken windows and set buildings on fire. Experiencing Times Square without the headlines scrolling around the Allied Chemical Tower was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. On Madison Avenue, Kathryn noticed more people carrying flashlights than briefcases. Broadway was deserted, with cars trapped in parking garages. And although there were smashed windows, the most severe thefts had occurred in other boroughs. Kathryn wondered what the subway would look like in complete darkness. As she descended, it was so dark, she could not literally see her hand in front of her face. And where were the tracks? Confused, uneasy, she quickly ran back up the staircase. And neither she nor the photographer thought about the Son of Sam during their visit. The anniversary of the first killing was approaching on July 29th. 2 days later, on July 31st, the Son of Sam struck again, the last time, killing a woman and blinding her date. Back in Pennsylvania, Kathryn interviewed a New York City officer who had recently been hired as chief of the Morrisville, PA Police Department. During the interview, she inquired if he knew anything about the Son of Sam case, and to her surprise, he did. He said that the NYPD were closer to an arrest than people realized. The shooter was likely Jewish or Italian, since all of his shootings occurred in ethnic neighborhoods where anyone who looked different would stand out. The officer predicted that the Son of Sam would be behind bars before the end of the summer. And remarkably, just 6 days later, on August 10th, David Berkowitz was arrested. He had killed 6 victims, the same number as Geschwendt. and the new chief of the Morrisville PD was correct. Memories of these crimes linger even after 5 decades have passed and new developments have occurred. Gary Mitchell, who almost went inside with his friend Johnny Apt on that fateful day, was in a bar when a patron asked, "Hey, when were the Apts killed?" Without hesitating, Gary replied, "March 12, 1976, causing the man's jaw to drop. Gary vividly remembered that he had lost 2 good friends that day. George Geschwendt? George died in 2020 at the age of 68 from sepsis while he was at the State Correctional Institute at Waymart in Wayne County, Pennsylvania. Clifford Apt, he died on August 20th, 1987 at 37, leaving a wife and stepdaughter. Michael says that Clifford's drug-related death prompted him to confront his own struggles with drugs, binge drinking, and a suicide attempt. Michael said, quote, "Right after Clifford died is when it really hit me. Enough's enough. I just walked away from everyone and everything illegal. It wasn't who I was. I totally turned myself around. I got a good job on the railroad, got sick, then retired." End quote. Michael Apt still lives in Bucks County. In a Northeast Times interview from March 2026, Michael Apt said of the killings, quote, "It's something I never got over. It totally fucked up my whole life. He killed 7 people that day. I just didn't stop breathing." End quote. The killings in his young adulthood changed everything. Michael was married once and has a son, daughter, and 3 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but he has little contact with them. He faces hearing, vision, and mobility issues and spends most of his time on the phone or sitting on the porch talking with a neighbor. Chief Larry Michaels, he became the county sheriff in 1981 and was reelected 5 times before he passed away in 2005. Intuitive Lieutenant Ted Zajac served as Bensalem's chief of police and retired in 1988, and Ted passed away in 2024. Detective Bob Eckert left the department to work as a supervisory special agent for the U.S. Department of State. He retired in 2010 and now lives in Florida. Detective Ed Kaiser retired as a detective sergeant in 1994 and currently resides in Los Angeles. Patrolman Dave Cleese, who discovered the Apt bodies that tragic night, served 29 years on the Bensalem police force. One evening in 1982, during a routine patrol in Trevose, he noticed a car parked at an odd angle positioned to have a clear view of the X-rated movie being shown in the Lincoln Drive-In Theater. Upon approaching the vehicle, he found Reverend Robert Hermley, a guidance counselor at a Catholic high school in Delaware, with 2 boys aged 13 and 14. This incident likely marked the first arrest of a Catholic priest for the sexual assault of a child. Hermley pleaded guilty and was sentenced to just 3 years probation, which is incredibly frustrating, and I could scream. Dave Cleese, he retired in 2002, and he and his wife still reside on Fleetwood Avenue. And Rich Fink, he later became the county's chief public defender before transitioning into a successful private practice. 10 years after the auction of the Volgenbergers' farmhouse and acreage, a group of residents raised enough money to purchase the property and preserved it as open space. It has since become a treasure for the community. Outdoor concerts are held there, and each year, around 100 people tend community garden plots. Artists occupy studios in the outbuildings, and one artist even incorporates Marguerite Volgenberger into her paintings. Kathryn writes a follow-up about nearly everybody in the book, and it is fascinating to see how lives unfold over the span of 50 years. And I just included a few of these stories. If you have been interested in my series on this book, I encourage you to read Kathryn Canavan's Killer in the House, because her in-depth exploration of events makes you feel like you are with her, seeing the events as they unfolded. And the descriptions of the 1970s culture brought back some wonderful memories. I have links to purchase Killer in the House from Amazon and Barnes & Noble on my blog. And my interview with her will drop next. So subscribe so you do not miss a thing. We got into a number of things that were not in the book. And thank you for Patreon murder bookies. Our next book is A Monster in Mount Pleasant, a story of murders and justice by C.J. Williams. So Mount Pleasant, Iowa is a quiet, idyllic town in 1978 when two brutal murders shatter the residents. Beautiful 16-year-old Carol Beavers is a vivacious high school junior, and her 58-year-old mother, Clementine, became the unsuspecting victims of a senseless act of violence. Terrified, Mount Pleasant residents begin locking their doors, fearing the killer that walks among them. And frustratingly, 6 months later, the case had gone cold. But then another shocking murder occurs. And now, law enforcement begins to connect the dots, leading to a suspect in all three murders. Yet 20 years would pass before the judicial system began to slowly grind towards resolution and justice. In the meanwhile, this dark chapter in Mount Pleasant left its mark, and life was never the same again. Author C.J. Williams has done meticulous research that truly captures the victims, who they were, the lives they led, and what was lost by them, the family, and the community. Thank you for listening as we're enjoying the summer. Always wear sunscreen and know that I appreciate your support. You can help me grow the podcast by taking a few minutes to leave a 5-star review on any of the platforms on which you listen. Questions, comments, email me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or find me on X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and you can join my Patreon for $2 to $4 a month if you really love the podcast. Trust your gut and happy reading. I see you as you hear me. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.